On the evening of September 6, 1868, Orkney Street in North Philadelphia looked like the sort of place where nothing larger than supper, church, and Monday work was supposed to matter. Children moved in and out of the last light. Women kept track of stoops, errands, and familiar voices. A widowed mother named Mary Mohrman had gone to church, leaving her youngest daughter in the care of older sisters. The child was 6 years old. She was known in the neighborhood simply as Little Mary, fair-haired, lively, and so familiar that no one needed to ask whose child she was. In a neighborhood like this, someone always had an eye on a child like Mary, or thought they usually did. That was the safety people believed they had. Mary was playing with another little girl outside when a man came near and asked for directions to Fifth and Dauphin. It was an ordinary question, the sort that could pass without notice in any working-class district where strangers drifted through on foot. Mary, eager and unafraid, said she could show him. Her companion did not go with them. The girl later said she became frightened and ran. The last thing she remembered clearly was the man taking Mary by the hand and leading her away through an alley. After that, the neighborhood continued for a few more minutes as if nothing had changed. Then mothers began calling names, sisters began checking corners, and one small absence turned an entire street inside out. By the time Mary's mother returned from church and learned what had happened, the first frantic search had already begun. Neighbors spread out across alleys, yards, and nearby streets. Police were brought in. Lamps were carried into places no one usually studied after dark. Men checked vacant lots. Women called into passageways and through open doors. Every minute that passed made the same question harder to answer. Why had no one stopped the man? Who was he? Why had he chosen that child, on that street, in that brief unguarded space between one adult glance and the next? In the first hours, there was still a desperate hope that Mary had wandered, been delayed, been found by someone else, been taken into a house and would soon be led home. That hope lasted exactly one night. That first search also changed the way the street sounded. Windows opened. Doors stayed ajar. Men who barely knew one another by name began trading fragments of memory, as if one extra detail might save the child. A woman remembered the hour by the church bell. Another recalled seeing Mary laughing only minutes before dusk. Someone thought a stranger had lingered too long near the corner. Someone else insisted that could not be right. This is how many historical murder cases begin, not with a single clear witness, but with a crowd of partial recollections gathering around a terrible blank space. The adults were trying to build a map quickly enough to outrun what had already happened. Instead, they were building the first version of the record. Uncertain, emotional, sincere, and already marked by the limits that would haunt the case from that point on for everyone there. It was gone by the next morning. On September 8th, in a sunken vacant lot at 6th Street and Susquehanna Avenue, Mary's body was found in a shallow pool of water. She had bruises on her neck, wrists, and arms. The physical evidence ruled out accident. The medical findings pointed not to accident, but to a predatory attack and strangulation. She had not disappeared into distance. She had been kept within the same neighborhood map that had failed to protect her. The discovery changed everything, and with it came 3 larger questions that would trouble the record long after the first shock had passed. Who had led her away? Why had the police failed to secure a clean case against any suspect when so many people were certain the killer lived nearby? And when the law finally named a man, did it prove the crime, or only close a wound the city could no longer bear to keep open? These streets may be forgotten, but the record remains. If this kind of crime story is why you're here, consider subscribing. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, because stories like this traveled far beyond the streets where they began. For the people on Orkney Street, though, the case was not a story yet. It was a child gone within sight of home, and by the time the body was found, grief had started turning into suspicion. Mary belonged to a German-American Catholic family living without the father who had once held the household together. He had died 2 years earlier, leaving her mother to raise 5 children on what a widow in that district could manage. There was nothing unusual about her background, at least not for Philadelphia in the 1860s. That was part of what made the crime feel so near to everyone who heard of it. There was no country lane, no distant road, no isolated field. There was a mother at church, older children left in charge, a summer evening, and a child known to half the block. When newspaper accounts later described the funeral at St. Boniface, they emphasized not spectacle but density. The church was crowded. The neighborhood came in numbers. People did not need persuasion to attend. They came because the case had entered the ordinary lives of parents with almost unbearable ease. People started looking at the block in a harder way now. Men were questioned. Several suspects were detained and released. Witnesses had seen enough to create dread, but not enough to fix identity with confidence. Someone had reportedly seen a man lead Mary away. Someone else may have seen a man carrying a bundle in the early hours before the body was found. Yet in crimes like this, small observations are only useful if they can be joined into a line the court will accept. In the days after the murder, the neighborhood produced fear, anger, and gossip in abundance. What it did not produce was a witness who could stand in court and say, without qualification, that this was the man. That gap mattered because suspicion settled early on the idea of a local perpetrator. Mary had not been taken far. Her body had been left in a lot not beyond the city, but within its pattern. Whoever killed her likely knew the streets, knew where a child could be led without immediate interruption, knew where a body might lie long enough to delay discovery. That theory pulled attention toward men who lived and worked nearby, men whose public faces could be measured against private unease. Among them was a young barber named John Hanlon, recently married, living close enough to the Mohrman family that proximity alone invited notice. He had a shop at street level of the house where he lived with his wife, mother, and relatives. In another account of another life, he might have remained only one more neighborhood tradesman. In this one, he lingered at the edge of suspicion and then slipped back out of legal reach. For more than a year, the case remained unresolved. Mary was buried. The city continued. But unresolved cases do not disappear in the minds of the people who live nearest to them. They settle into conversation. They attach themselves to children being called in before dusk. They change how doorways are watched. They alter what counts as ordinary. That was the silent afterlife of Mary's murder even before the investigation moved again. When no arrest leads to trial, the absence itself begins to shape a neighborhood. The killer becomes both present and unprovable. Every familiar face can briefly carry the weight of possibility, and every failure to prove anything begins to feel like its own kind of danger. The case turned not because new physical evidence emerged from the original crime scene, but because another incident drew police attention back toward a man they had never entirely forgotten. In late 1869, a man using the alias Charles Harris was arrested after attempting to drag a 10-year-old girl away from the yard of a church. Her cries brought help before the attack could go further. That alone would have marked him as dangerous. What made the matter explosive was the discovery that Charles Harris was John Hanlon. He had moved within Philadelphia and changed his name, but detectives connected him to the old file on Mary Mohrman. To them, the new offense did not merely suggest depravity. It seemed to illuminate the old crime with a certainty they had wanted from the beginning. There had been earlier complaints around Hanlon as well. Reports linked him to an assault on a woman walking with her younger sister, a case in which he had allegedly struck at them and then escaped serious consequence. None of this proved he had killed Mary. Yet, in the logic of a 19th-century murder investigation, moral pattern often pressed hard against legal proof. The police did not merely suspect a man who had once been near the case. They believed they had found, in his later conduct, the character of the earlier offender. That distinction would define everything that followed. A community can be morally certain and still legally exposed. A jury can be convinced by the shape of a man before it is convinced by the exact chain of evidence. Between those two things lies the danger of both acquittal and injustice. With Hanlon already imprisoned on the later offense, detectives pursued the line that had eluded them the first time. They arranged for him to share a cell with another prisoner, a career criminal named Michael Dunn. Dunn's value was not his character, but his usefulness. If Hanlon would not confess to the police, perhaps he would speak to another prisoner. According to Dunn, that is exactly what happened. He later claimed Hanlon admitted abducting Mary, disguising himself to avoid recognition, attacking her, killing her to silence her, and hiding the body before carrying it out under cover of darkness. It was the kind of confession that, if believed, could convert a cold case into a coherent prosecution. It was also the kind of confession that defense counsel could attack from every angle. Dunn had every reason to help the detectives. His own criminal record was long. He was not a neutral witness who had stumbled into truth by accident. He was a man placed beside the suspect for the purpose of extraction, and everyone in court understood that. Still, the prosecution now had what it had previously lacked: a narrative of the crime that could be spoken aloud in sequence. They had the child witness who had seen Mary led away. They had testimony that a man had been seen carrying a bundle before dawn. They had Hanlon's later attack on another girl. And through Dunn, they had a statement that appeared to bind those fragments into a single story. Whether the story was true, embellished, or purchased by incentive became the central question of the trial. When Hanlon was finally tried in late 1870, the case drew intense attention. Selecting a jury was difficult because so many had already formed an opinion. The courtroom filled each day. It was not only the murder of a child that kept public attention fixed there. It was also the length of time between the crime and the prosecution, the city's hunger for closure, and the unnerving possibility that the man at the bar had once escaped punishment only to offend again. A trial like that becomes more than the weighing of evidence. It becomes a test of whether the institutions that failed in the first instance can still restore confidence through a verdict. Witness by witness, the prosecution laid out its case. Caroline Dinglacker, still young, described the man who had approached the girls and taken Mary away. Charlie Mass testified about seeing a man carrying what looked like a bundle in the early morning hours around the time the body was left in the lot. Most importantly, Michael Dunn repeated the alleged jailhouse confession. The prosecution's burden was not to prove each fragment beyond any possible challenge in isolation. It was to persuade the jury that the fragments reinforced one another, that proximity, later conduct, witness observations, and confession formed a pattern too strong to dismiss. The defense fought hardest where the case was weakest. Dunn, they argued, was a perjurer rewarded for convenience. A confession delivered through a jailhouse informant was not the same as a confession freely made and reliably recorded. Caroline, examined closely and for a long time, was pressed on inconsistencies between what she had said earlier and what she now recalled. Charlie Mass had seen a bundle, yes, but could not identify the man carrying it. Hanlon denied ever making the admissions Dunn described. The defense position was not that the crime had not occurred, or that someone would not someday deserve punishment for it. It was that the state was building certainty out of suspicion, and using a child's murder to make an example where the facts were not complete. That conflict between emotional plausibility and evidentiary strength gave the proceedings their force. Hanlon looked to many like the kind of man who would have done it. But courts are meant to determine whether he did. Those are not the same question. Still, trials do not unfold in sterile rooms outside public feeling. A murdered child had become a civic wound. A suspect with a predatory history sat before the court. The prosecution's story answered the city's need for sequence, motive, and disposal. The defense answered with doubt, but doubt is a colder instrument. It rarely feels equal to grief. The jury deliberated for more than a day before returning a verdict of guilty of first-degree murder. That interval mattered. It suggested they had not embraced the case casually. Yet their final decision also revealed how powerful cumulative suspicion can become once it settles around a defendant already marked by later conduct. When sentence was about to be pronounced, Hanlon stood holding a Bible and denounced the witnesses against him as perjurers. He accused detectives of paying for testimony and warned that he was being murdered by false evidence. It was the speech of a condemned man who might have been lying, or might have been naming the exact mechanism by which the law had finally taken hold of him. The record cannot fully answer which. Appeals failed. Execution was set, delayed, and then fixed again. In the months before he was hanged, Hanlon's conduct gave the public little certainty and much to interpret. Accounts described him undertaking severe physical penance, fasting, giving up tobacco, sleeping without comfort, preparing himself for death under religious guidance. He reportedly apologized to the detectives he had once condemned for the harshness of his courtroom words. Yet even then, he did not deliver the clean final confession the authorities wanted. That absence mattered as much as any speech. Had a guilty man retreated into religion without courage to say the words? Or had an innocent man, broken by the inevitability of execution, chosen peace over one last argument no one would believe? On February 1, 1871, inside Moyamensing prison, John Hanlon was hanged. Public reaction outside the prison walls leaned toward relief. For many parents, the case had come to represent a threat close to home, and the hanging felt like a civic exhale. Yet even some contemporary observers admitted discomfort with the methods that had made the conviction possible. The use of Michael Dunn was openly defended on the grounds that the end justified the means. That phrase often survives in murder cases longer than the details of the rope, the scaffold, or the last meal. It says almost everything about the risk built into the verdict. If the end must justify the means, then the means themselves were never beyond question. So the first of these three cases leaves behind two records, not one. In one record, a brutal child killer lived near his victim, escaped the first investigation, exposed himself through later conduct, and was eventually brought to justice. In the other, a city desperate for resolution took a morally repellent man, surrounded him with suspicion, used a compromised witness to supply the missing link, and killed him with doubt still attached to the file. The two records never sit cleanly together, which is what leaves the case unsettled. Mary Mohrman's death is certain. The strength of the proof against the man hanged for it remains less so. And when a case ends that way, the verdict does not close the corridor of questions. It only places a door at the far end and asks whether anyone ever truly reached it. If you've stayed with this case so far, tell me whether you think the execution answered the crime or merely ended the public pressure around it. Then stay with me, because the next case did not begin in a city street. It began inside a rural household where many people heard what was happening long before anyone stopped it. In the hills of Vermont, where farms, roads, and river bends could make a small community feel both intimate and far apart, a child named Alice Meaker entered a house that was supposed to take her in, and instead became the place that destroyed her. Her father was dead. Her mother, struggling and remarried, could not keep both children. Alice and her younger brother became town dependents, their lives managed by officials and money rather than by any stable idea of home. The town of Charlotte arranged for her care with a relative in Duxbury, paying a sum to place the children there until they were old enough to work for themselves. Even the surviving record cannot keep its details perfectly straight. Some accounts call the relative an uncle, others a half-brother. Even the family surname appears as Meaker in some reports and Meaker in others. But on the essential facts, the record is steady. Alice was a child sent into a household by public arrangement. Within a year, she was dead. That household outwardly resembled many others shaped by poverty and labor. Horace Meaker was a struggling farmer. His wife, Emmeline, ran the domestic center of the home with hard force. Their son, Alman, was grown but dependent, regarded by some as weak-minded, pliable, and easily led. Alice was small, timid, and by all descriptions the kind of child least able to defend herself against cruelty. If you stood far enough away from the place, you might have seen only a poor family taking in poorer kin. That was the public version. The private one was carried in the cries neighbors heard across fields and roads. Witnesses later described Emmeline beating Alice with broom handles, sticks, shingles, and whatever lay nearest to hand. She slapped her while she tried to knit, struck her in the kitchen, chased her into yards and sheds, and threatened to whip her to death. Alice was made to do chores beyond her strength. Picking potato bugs early in the morning before school, carrying stones, working long after other children were done for the day. Some neighbors claimed they could hear the blows and the child's crying from a considerable distance. One woman remembered inviting Alice over to play with her daughter and receiving only a frail smile in return. These were not hidden injuries in the sense that no one knew. They were known, spoken of, and endured at a distance. The household had become the sort of place that a community recognized as cruel without yet forcing itself to intervene. And here is where the story turns. In cases like this, murder rarely arrives without warning. By the time Alice disappeared, the people around that house in Duxbury had heard far too much and seen too much. They knew she was being worked past her strength. They knew Emmeline's temper could turn on her without warning. What they did not have, or believed they did not have, was a way to step in without making her life worse. So the abuse stayed inside the house even when it was no secret outside it. The poisoning did not come out of nowhere. It came after months of noise, fear, and hesitation, with the child still trapped exactly where everyone knew she was. By the spring of 1880, that inward pressure had moved from cruelty to removal. According to later confession evidence, Emmeline did not merely want Alice corrected, disciplined, or relocated. She wanted her gone. She complained about the burden of having the girl in the house. She talked of taking her away and leaving her to starve in the mountains. When that plan seemed too uncertain, poison entered the discussion. The murder, if the later sworn confession is accepted, was not a sudden domestic eruption. It was considered in advance, argued over, and prepared for. That fact is often what distinguishes neglect from design. A household can be savage in habit. It becomes something colder when it begins arranging transport, timing, and means. One night in late April, after the father had gone to bed, the plan was set in motion. The exact date varies slightly across reports, but the basic sequence does not. Alman had acquired strychnine from a druggist in Waterbury. A horse and team had been hired. Alice was taken from her bed, in some accounts with a sack pulled over her head to muffle her cries, in others with the promise of a ride. She was conveyed out into the night by Emmeline and Alman. They stopped where water could be drawn, mixed the poison with sweetened liquid in a cup or dipper, and forced the child to drink. It was a slow and terrifying death. The record says the child cried out. Hands were placed over her mouth, under a covered bridge or nearby. While the poison worked through her, the two adults remained with her until she died. Afterward, the body was carried into a swamp or muck hole and concealed under rails, stumps, or boards. It was not a burial with care. It was a disposal done at night by people who needed the household to look unchanged by morning. That attempt at normalcy never held. Neighbors soon noticed Alice was missing. They asked where she had gone. The answers shifted. She had stepped out. She had climbed from a window and run away. She had gone to visit her mother. She had been taken toward Canada. The contradictions did not show cunning. They showed strain. And in small communities, contradiction is often the first thing that pulls official attention through the door. Deputy Sheriff Frank Atherton began asking questions. What had happened to the girl? Why had Ullman hired a team? Why did his account differ from that of his father? Who had really been in the house that night? Each answer produced another discrepancy. Under sustained examination, Ullman broke. His confessions changed over time, but the first one told the sheriff enough to make recovery possible. He led Atherton to the site where Alice had been hidden. The sheriff later described reaching through shallow water and mud to feel the body. When the remains were taken back, the journey itself became part of the memory of the case. The buggy was small. At one point, Ullman had to hold Alice's body upright so it would not fall. Historical crime records sometimes preserve details that seem almost too stark to be true. This is one of them. A child abused in life was carried in death by one of the people who had helped put her there. The community reaction was immediate and fierce. Anger traveled faster than formal procedure. Reports described the public as worked into a near frenzy, with threats of lynching and strong guard placed around the accused. That response was not only about the murder itself. It was also about the dawning recognition that many people had seen the path leading toward it. Once the body was found, every earlier whipping, every cry heard across a field, every sighting of Alice laboring beyond her strength became part of a new collective guilt. Public outrage in such cases often contains self-indictment. Punishes late what it tolerated early. The medical proof added structure to the confession. Doctors could not identify a single gross injury sufficient on its own to explain death, but the organs showed congestion and suspicion turned strongly toward poison. Then Professor Whithoss of the University of Vermont performed tests on stomach contents. One of them, notorious now for how 19th century science met 19th century courtroom drama, involved introducing material from the child's stomach into a frog and observing the spasms that pointed to strychnine poisoning. Chemical testing reportedly produced the expected color reaction as well. In the language of the day, the presence of strychnine was conclusively established. That mattered because it transformed the case from mere confession and concealment into a prosecution grounded by forensic indication, however primitive the methods may now seem. Yet even this case, which feels at first glance more straightforward than the Mary Mohrman case, did not proceed without instability. Ullman altered his account more than once. At times he placed the blame heavily on his mother. At others, he tried to take the full burden on himself. The reasons are not difficult to imagine. He was dependent on her, frightened, and possibly dominated by her personality long before any official interrogation began. Emmeline, for her part, denied knowledge, then made remarks that suggested knowledge, then insisted on innocence all the way to the scaffold. Horace, the father, was described by many as deaf and unaware, though the degree of his ignorance remains one of those points the record never entirely settles. In other words, even where the broad shape of guilt appears clear, the precise distribution of responsibility remained contested. At trial, the state pursued both Emmeline and Ullman for first-degree murder. A separate issue arose over whether they should be tried jointly or apart, but the larger public drama centered on the mother. Ullman eventually pleaded guilty. Emmeline fought conviction, represented by counsel who attempted to limit the use of Ullman's shifting account against her and challenge the structure of the prosecution. Still, the surrounding proof was heavy. Neighbors testified to long-standing abuse. The poison purchase was traceable. The body had been recovered where the confession said it would be. Statements attributed to Emmeline before and after the murder suggested both hostility toward Alice and panic once the sheriff closed in. The jury convicted both mother and son. Sentences of death were imposed on both. Even in a century far more accustomed to capital punishment than our own, that outcome invited reconsideration. Ullman's role, though undeniable, was increasingly viewed through the lens of subordination. He was seen as intellectually limited, morally weak, and under his mother's influence. Vermont's legislature commuted his death sentence to life imprisonment. Emmeline did not receive the same mercy. Her case moved through appeals and legal challenges, but the judgment stood. During imprisonment, she reportedly alternated between violence and stillness. There were claims she tried to set fire to her confinement, attacked officials, and later quieted into long stretches of knitting and waiting. Whether those episodes reflected madness, calculation, or despair was debated. They did not save her. On March 30, 1883, at Windsor Prison, Emmeline Meaker was led to the gallows. Reports of executions from that period often dwell on dress, appetite, composure, and last words, as if the state needed to document not only death but demeanor. Emmeline ate breakfast well. She asked to see the gallows and remarked that it was not half as bad as she had imagined. When asked at the end if she had anything to say, she maintained that she was innocent and that she was being put to death unjustly. There is a brutal symmetry in that statement. Alice had spent part of her brief life unable to make adults act on what they already knew. Emmeline, at the moment the state acted decisively against her, still insisted the story had been told wrong. This case does not linger because of uncertainty over whether Alice was murdered. It lingers because it exposes several failures at once. There is the failure of a family arrangement made through poverty and public management, where a child became an obligation with a cash value attached. There is the failure of neighbors who knew enough to fear but not enough, or not early enough, to intervene. There is the failure of a domestic order that treated a dependent child as disposable labor before treating her as expendable life. And there is the judicial record, which succeeded in punishing the killers only after every softer mechanism of protection had already broken. What makes the case so difficult to leave behind is not the execution, though that is what fixed Emmeline in Vermont memory. It is the fact that Alice's murder had a long preface that many people heard in real time. The child was not killed by a sudden intruder, or in some unanticipated flash of violence. She was killed at the end of a pattern. That pattern was audible. It had witnesses. It had warnings. The body recovered from the swamp did not reveal a hidden world. It revealed what a community had tolerated at the edge of its own awareness until the matter could no longer be described as discipline, hardship, or somebody else's household. By the time the state finally acted, the damage had already been unfolding in plain hearing for so many months. On a warm July afternoon in 1911, 10-year-old Amy Reeves sat in her yard eating bread and butter. It was the last time her mother would see her alive. Amy had spent part of the day at home rather than at school, helping with household work at Kitsmead Cottage near Chertsey Common in the village of Longcross, Surrey. Her mother saw her there around 12:30. Nothing about it looked remarkable then. That was the danger. Longcross was not London, though the city lay within reach. It was a rural place of cottages, common land, and scattered households, the sort of community where people knew whose child was walking the road and where a pond could remain ordinary until something gave reason to fear it. By all surviving descriptions, Amy was lively, useful around the house, and familiar to the neighborhood. It was a small, ordinary moment, the kind where children so often vanish entirely. There had already been one detail that would later matter. Earlier in the day, or around the same broad stretch of hours, Amy had been seen with Albert Hampton, a 16-year-old gardener from nearby Chobham who was known in the area through family visits. Nothing about that sighting by itself made it notable then. A village boy and a younger child in a yard did not produce alarm. The significance came later, after Amy failed to return, after time hardened from delay into worry, and after the line of the day had to be reconstructed backward from the body. Amy's father came home around 8:30 that evening and was not at first alarmed by her absence. Children in such places often remained outdoors later than strict city habits would permit. But by 9 o'clock, when her brothers could not find her, concern sharpened. Search began close to home and moved outward in widening circles. About 200 yards from the cottage lay a small round pond or dip hole on Chertsey Common. It was not deep by ordinary standards, only inches of water over mud and weed. Yet depth is a poor measure of danger when violence has already intervened. Around 10 that night, Amy's father reached the pond and found her there. The details at the scene were precise enough to feel almost staged, which is often what makes such scenes unforgettable. Amy's boots and stockings were on the bank. Her body lay in shallow water and mud, her head caught down among weeds. She had wounds to the head. Doctors later identified several distinct injuries, including a significant wound near the eye. The arrangement suggested not a child wandering into water and failing to rise, but an assault followed by placement or collapse in the pond. There were no great dramatic markers at the scene. No wild disorder, no long trail, no obvious blood spread across the bank. Instead, There were controlled, limited facts that forced a more difficult conclusion. Someone had acted quickly, at close range, and within a landscape the child already knew. The inquest and police investigation began where such cases often begin, with the body, the immediate ground, and the question of whether the scene told of accident, impulse, or intent. Superintendent Mears, Inspector Pike, and Sergeant Alfred Bettison examined the site carefully. A large stick was recovered from the pond. On it were hairs described as fair or light brown, consistent with Amy's coloring. Nearby, investigators noticed that a birch sapling appeared to have been freshly chopped. That detail mattered because if the murder weapon had been fashioned or cut close to the scene, the landscape itself had supplied part of the method. It also meant the police were not looking only for a blow. They were looking for preparation, however brief. Their work led them beyond the pond to a shed near the residence of a local man named Stevens, where Inspector Pike found a chopping tool. Fibers and material adhering to the blade reportedly resembled the wet sandy matter from the bank where the birch had been cut. Amy's injuries, the stick from the pond, the chopped sapling, and the recovered tool did not yet identify a killer, but they gave the case the kind of physical sequence investigators depend on. A child goes missing. The body is found in shallow water. The head injuries imply assault. Possible weapon is recovered. A cutting instrument connects to the preparation of that weapon. None of this settled identity. It simply narrowed the universe of chance. Identity entered through witness recollection. Albert Hampton had been seen with Amy earlier in the day. He had also reportedly been carrying a stout stick around Longcross and had made the sort of careless boast that gains terrible significance only afterward, remarking that it would make a fine cudgel. Another witness placed him not far from the area in the early afternoon, appearing flurried and offering an explanation that he had been asleep under an apple tree. Contradictory statements about his movements began to accumulate. In a murder investigation, it is sometimes the inconsistency more than the original act that draws the net tight. The police did not yet have direct proof that Hampton had struck the child, but they had proximity, suspicious behavior, a suggestive object, and an emerging pattern of unease. On the evening after the body was discovered, Inspector Pike stopped Hampton in Chobham Street and told him he would be taken to Chertsey and charged with causing Amy Reeves's death by striking her on the head with a thick stick. Hampton denied it. The denial itself is not remarkable. Almost every accused person denies at first. What gave the case its tension was that the denial stood against circumstantial weight rather than against some single definitive contradiction. His clothes and boots were examined. The scene was searched for traces of dragging or a prolonged struggle. Investigators tried to make the physical facts and the witness statements settle into one another. They came close, but close is not the same as complete. That distinction decided the legal outcome. At the inquest and related proceedings, the evidence pointed strongly enough toward homicide for the verdict to be willful murder. Yet it did not point strongly enough toward Hampton, in the eyes of the magistrate, to commit him for trial. The suspicion against him was openly acknowledged. His contradictions had brought it upon him. He had been seen with the victim, seen with a stick, and linked by circumstance to the time and place. But the case remained circumstantial. No witness saw the fatal assault. No direct forensic proof in the modern sense fixed the weapon in his hand at the exact moment of the crime. On August 11, 1911, Hampton was discharged. Amy Reeves's killer, in law, remained unnamed. That result gives the case its particular sting. In the first story, a man was executed despite lingering doubt over the means by which the proof was assembled. In the second, the killers were punished, but only after a long visible pattern of abuse that should never have been allowed to continue. In this third case, the police built what looked like a plausible path toward an answer and still could not carry it over the line. That is a different kind of failure. It is not the failure of community blindness, nor exactly the failure of overreach. It is the failure of sufficiency. The investigators may have had the right suspect. They may not have. The surviving record allows both possibilities to remain alive, which is precisely why the case continues to unsettle. Amy's murder also reveals how much can be established about a crime and how little about its final actor. The pond was measured. The body position was recorded. The wounds were counted. The stick was found. The sapling was identified. The tool was seized. The suspect was located, questioned, and charged. Official machinery moved with seriousness and detail. And still, the answer did not arrive. For families, this is often the hardest part of any historical murder case to sit with. We tend to assume that careful attention will produce resolution. The record says otherwise. There are cases in which a body can be read with precision and justice still cannot name the hand that made it necessary. Think for a moment about what that meant for the Reeves family. Their daughter left the yard before midday. By nightfall, her father had found her in common water not far from home. Authorities concluded she had been murdered. A local boy was arrested and then released. The official verdict identified the nature of the crime without identifying the person responsible. There is a peculiar cruelty in that kind of ending. It does not deny the family the truth that a wrong was done. It denies them the full sentence in which that truth can live. Murder by person unknown is not an empty finding. It is a completed accusation with a missing name. By the time we place these three cases beside one another, their differences are obvious. One is urban, one rural, one village. One ended with execution clouded by evidentiary dispute. One ended with punishment after long private abuse became public homicide. One ended with willful murder entered into the record and no one finally held to answer for it. Yet what ties them together is stronger than the differences in geography. In every case, a child moved through an environment presumed to be legible to adults. A street, a household, common near home. Those environments were not strange. They were familiar. The danger entered not from some distant unknown realm, but through ordinary structures that people thought they understood. There is also a deeper common thread running through all three. The problem of what communities know before law can prove, or after law has failed to prove enough. In Philadelphia, many believed they knew the sort of man who killed Mary, and perhaps they were right, but the path from belief to proof was ethically compromised. In Vermont, neighbors knew Alice was being brutalized, and that knowledge sat in the open until murder forced action. In Surrey, the police may have known, in the ordinary human sense of reasonable conviction, where suspicion most properly lay. But conviction is not the same as proof beyond the threshold required to destroy a life in court. Historical crime often lives in that gap. Not the gap between innocence and guilt, but the gap between what seems true and what can be carried whole and intact into judgment. That is why these forgotten cases endure better than many famous ones. The famous cases are often remembered because they yield a final phrase, a notorious face, a satisfying villain, or a clean official answer. These do not. Mary Mohrman leaves behind a convicted man and a question mark. Alice Meaker leaves behind a punished killer and a community that heard the prelude. Amy Reeves leaves behind a careful investigation and the cold remainder of insufficiency. None of those endings allow the audience the comfort of simple moral bookkeeping. The dead do not return because a verdict was read. The uncertain do not become certain because an execution took place. And a file does not become complete simply because an inquest ruled out accident. So what do we do with cases like these now, when the witnesses are gone, the neighborhoods altered, and the legal actors reduced to lines in archives? Perhaps the first obligation is restraint. Not to make them larger than they were, but to let the record speak at its proper weight. Mary was a real child in a real street, not merely a symbol for a city's fear. Alice was not only the victim of a notorious woman. She was also the child a whole structure of poverty and indifference failed before poison ever entered the cup. Amy was not simply an unsolved rural homicide. She was a girl whose final day can be traced almost hour by hour until the trace stops at a pond and the law can go no further. Respect begins there, in refusing to turn uncertainty into theater. The second obligation is harder. It is to recognize that justice in historical crime is rarely a single moment. Sometimes it is absent. Sometimes it arrives contaminated by the methods used to secure it. Sometimes it comes only after preventable suffering. And sometimes it appears in fragments. A recovered body, a named cause of death, a public record that refuses to call murder an accident even when it cannot name the killer. That is not enough, but it is not nothing. The archive often preserves the limit as honestly as it preserves the fact. No surviving record confirms more than it can support. No honest narrator should pretend otherwise. And that may be the quietest, most difficult lesson these three stories leave behind. The past does not owe us closure. It leaves us testimony, contradiction, procedure, rumor, and silence in unequal measure. We can follow the corridor almost to its end. We can see the outlines of what happened. We can watch the law succeed, fail, overreach, or arrive too late. But there are cases where the final door never fully opens. Mary Mohrman's killer may have died on the scaffold, or may have gone unnamed behind a guilty man. Alice Meeker's murder was answered in court, but not before many people had already heard the life being beaten out of her future. Amy Reeves's murderer was recognized by someone, perhaps many people, perhaps only by the person who did it, and then was left beyond formal reach. What do you think justice looks like when certainty never fully arrives, or arrives only after other failures have done their work? And which of these three cases stays with you most strongly? The one answered by a doubtful conviction, the one exposed by a child's long abuse, or the one that ended with a verdict and no final name? If you found this thought-provoking, subscribe for more forgotten historical crime stories told from the surviving record. Until next time, remember that the archive is not a place where the dead speak clearly. It is the place where what was written down endures, and where what was never proved still waits between the lines.